A classroom filled with students. A tired but dedicated teacher, Mrs. Carter, stands at the front. She looks over her students, her eyes briefly landing on a quiet boy sitting alone at the back. Have you ever had someone believe in you when you had lost all faith in yourself? Sometimes, a single act of kindness can change a life forever. The camera zooms in on the boy, Daniel. His eyes are downcast, avoiding any attention. He twirls a pencil in his fingers, but his notebook remains empty. This is the story of an unsung hero, a teacher who never asked for recognition, never sought praise. But one simple act of compassion set off a chain of events that neither she nor her student could have imagined. Mrs. Carter watches Daniel with concern. She flips through the test papers in her hands, stopping at his. A deep sigh escapes her lips. It's nearly blank. Later that evening, Mrs. Carter sits at her desk, rubbing her temples, her eyes lingering on Daniel's file. His grades are slipping, his attendance sporadic, and yet, she sees something in him. Mrs. Carter, to herself, softly, I won't let him slip through the cracks. We all have that one person who pushes us toward greatness. But what happens when the student finally gets a chance to repay the teacher? A modest suburban school. The morning bell rings. Students chatter and rush into classrooms. Mrs. Carter stands by her desk, watching them settle in. Daniel enters the room, head down. His clothes are slightly worn. His backpack looks empty. He moves to the farthest corner, making himself invisible. Meet Mrs. Carter, a teacher who has spent over 20 years shaping young minds. To her, teaching isn't just about textbooks and grades. It's about the lives behind them. Mrs. Carter in a teacher's lounge, speaking with another teacher, Marb Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins. Daniel Walker? That kid's a lost cause, Carter. He's failing every subject, barely shows up. I say focus on the ones who care. Mrs. Carter, firmly. Every student cares. Some just don't know how to show it yet. Mrs. Carter in class. She writes a math equation on the board and turns to see Daniel staring blankly at his desk. Mrs. Carter, gently. Daniel, can you try solving this one? Daniel shifts uncomfortably. A few students snicker. He shakes his head, refusing to look up. Daniel Walker wasn't lazy. He wasn't unintelligent. He was drowning in silence, carrying burdens no one else could see. Daniel at home, a dimly lit apartment. His mother, weary and exhausted, is counting crumpled dollar bills on the table. The fridge is nearly empty. Daniel watches her, his face emotionless. Fade back to the classroom. Mrs. Carter watches Daniel as he stares at the clock, waiting for the day to end. Mrs. Carter saw something in Daniel, a quiet plea for help hidden behind indifferent eyes. And she wasn't about to let him slip away. A quiet classroom after school. The desks are empty except for one. Daniel sits at the back, staring at his notebook. Mrs. Carter approaches, pulling a chair beside him. Mrs. Carter. Daniel, I noticed you've been struggling. I want to help. Will you stay after school for tutoring? Daniel hesitates. He shifts uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against the desk. Daniel, shrugging. I don't think it'll help. Mrs. Carter. What if we try? No pressure, no grades. Just you and me figuring things out together. Daniel studies her face, searching for any sign of pity. He doesn't find any, only patience. The first tutoring session. The classroom is quiet except for the scratching of pencils. Daniel stares at the math problem in front of him, frustration evident. Daniel, grumbling. I don't get it. Numbers don't make sense to me. Mrs. Carter, smiling. Numbers are like puzzles. You just have to find the right way to put them together. Let's start simple. She writes a basic problem on the board, breaking it down step by step. Daniel watches, arms crossed, still doubtful. But he listens. At first, Daniel resisted. He was used to failing, used to people giving up on him. But Mrs. Carter wasn't just another teacher. She was someone who refused to walk away. Days turn into weeks. Mrs. Carter patiently explains problems. Daniel slowly starts engaging. One evening, he solves a simple problem by himself. A flicker of pride crosses his face, though he hides it quickly. The school hallway. Daniel walks past a group of students. A boy, Jason, sneers. Jason, mocking. Didn't know you were Mrs. Carter's charity project, Walker. Daniel stiffens. He clenches his fists but says nothing. He walks away, but the words linger. Change isn't easy. And for Daniel, the fear of being seen as weak almost made him walk away. Almost. That evening, Daniel sits at his tiny kitchen table, staring at his half-finished homework. His mother, weary from work, watches him. Daniel's MOM, softly. I heard you stayed late at school. Everything okay? Daniel, quietly. Yeah. I think Mrs. Carter actually believes I can do better. His mother's eyes soften, a flicker of hope in them. She nods. Daniel's MO. Then maybe you should believe it too. The next day, Mrs. Carter finds Daniel already in the classroom after school, pencil in hand, ready to work. Mrs. Carter, smiling, ready to try again? Daniel, nodding, determined. Yeah, let's do this. A school hallway. A notice board stands in the center, covered with colorful flyers. One particular sheet catches Daniel's attention. Math competition. Sign up now. Asterisk. He stares at it, uncertain. Asterisk. The classroom after school. Mrs. Carter and Daniel sit at a desk covered in worksheets. Mrs. Carter, casually. Did you see the flyer about the math competition? Daniel, frowning. Yeah. So. Mrs. Carter, smiling. So, I think you should enter. Daniel blinks, then laughs, a short, humorless sound. Daniel, you're kidding, right? I can barely pass my tests. Mrs. Carter, that's not true. You've come a long way, Daniel, and I think you're ready for this. He looks away, jaw clenched. Daniel, people like me don't win competitions. Mrs. Carter leans forward, her voice gentle but firm. Mrs. Carter, people like you? You mean hardworking students who refuse to give up? Silence. Daniel fidgets, uncertainty in his eyes. Mrs. Carter, you don't have to win, Daniel. Just try. Prove to yourself that you can do this. Daniel staring at the competition sign-up sheet later that day. He hesitates, then, slowly, picks up a pen and writes his name. Daniel studying harder than ever. Late nights at his small kitchen table, scribbling equations. Mrs. Carter pushing him, encouraging him. Moments of frustration where he nearly gives up, but each time, he picks up the pencil again. The day of the competition, a large auditorium filled with students. Daniel sits at a desk, staring at the test in front of him, hands slightly shaking. Fear crept in. Doubt whispered that he wasn't good enough. But another voice, stronger this time, reminded him of all the nights spent learning, of every moment Mrs. Carter believed in him. Daniel takes a deep breath. He starts solving the first question. The results board being posted. Students rush forward. Daniel hesitates, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, he sees his name. His eyes widen. He didn't win first place, but next to his name, third place. A small, incredulous smile tugs at his lips. Mrs. Carter's classroom. Daniel enters, holding his certificate. Daniel, softly, almost shyly. I place third. Mrs. Carter turns, eyes lighting up. She doesn't hide her pride. Mrs. Carter, I knew you could do it. For the first time, Daniel lets himself believe it too. A bustling school hallway. Students chat and laugh, but Daniel walks with purpose now. His shoulders are straighter, his steps more confident. He's still quiet, but something has changed. He believes in himself. Mrs. Carter's classroom after school. Daniel sits at a desk, solving problems on his own. Mrs. Carter watches from her desk, a small smile on her face. He no longer needs her to push him. He pushes himself now. Growth isn't about sudden miracles. It's about the small victories, the moments when we prove to ourselves that we are capable. The school's final exam week. Daniel sits in a large exam hall, gripping his pencil. He reads through the test, his brows furrowing in concentration. Unlike before, he doesn't panic. He starts writing, his mind sharp and focused. A week later, the results are posted on a bulletin board. Daniel walks up hesitantly. He scans the list, heart pounding. Then, He sees it. His name, listed among the top scores. His breath catches. He did it. He actually did it. Mrs. Carter's classroom. Daniel enters, his test paper in hand, a solid A marked at the top. He places it on her desk. Daniel, quietly, but firmly. Thank you. Mrs. Carter picks up the paper, a proud smile forming. Mrs. Carter. You did this, Daniel. I just helped you see what was already there. Daniel nods, swallowing hard. For the first time in years, he feels something unfamiliar. Hope? Fatio. A graduation ceremony. Students toss their caps in the air. Daniel stands among them, wearing his own cap and gown. His mother watches from the crowd, tears of pride in her eyes. Daniel Walker, once a struggling student, now a young man with a future. And all because one teacher refused to give up on him. A bright morning. The familiar classroom is exactly the same. Rows of desks, the old chalkboard, the soft hum of students chatting before class. Mrs. Carter sits at her desk, flipping through some papers. The door opens. A tall, confident young man in a well-tailored suit steps in. He carries a leather briefcase, his gaze scanning the room. Mrs. Carter looks up and freezes. Her eyes widen as recognition dawns. MRS Carter, softly, almost in disbelief. Daniel? Daniel Walker smiles. The same boy she once knew, but different. Older, stronger, successful. Daniel grinning. It's been a long time, Mrs. Carter. The two sitting across from each other, much like they used to all those years ago. Except now, Daniel is no longer a struggling student. He's a man with a story to tell. Mrs. Carter, look at you. A professional. What have you been up to all these years? Daniel chuckles, setting his briefcase on the desk. Daniel, well, let's see. I went to college on a full scholarship, studied finance, started my own firm, and now I help kids who grew up like me. Kids who don't believe they're smart enough, good enough. Kids who just need someone to believe in them. Mrs. Carter listens, emotion filling her eyes. MRS Carter, proudly, that's incredible, Daniel. He reaches into his briefcase, pulling out a thick envelope. He slides it across the desk to her. Daniel, I actually came here for a reason. I started a scholarship fund for students who need help the way I once did. And I wanted you to be the first to know. Mrs. Carter blinks, looking down at the envelope. When she opens it, her breath catches. Inside are documents outlining the Carter Foundation for Student Success. MRS Carter, voice shaking. You named it after me? Daniel smiles, his eyes warm. Daniel, of course. You changed my life. It's only right that I help change others in your name. Silence hangs between them, thick with unspoken gratitude. Then, Mrs. Carter lets out a small laugh, wiping at the corner of her eye. Mrs. Carter, you always were full of surprises, Daniel. Daniel, smirking. Guess I had a good teacher. Daniel standing at the front of the classroom, speaking to the students. He tells them his story, about struggle, doubt, and the teacher who refused to give up on him. The students listen, some leaning forward, hanging on to every word. Mrs. Carter watches from her desk, a proud smile on her face. Sometimes, the greatest impact we have is the one we don't even realize we're making. A teacher helped a struggling student, and years later, he walked into her classroom with life-changing news. Not just for himself, but for generations to come. A quote appears on the screen as soft, inspiring music plays. A teacher affects eternity. They can never tell where their influence stops. Henry Adams. The best gifts in life aren't always material. Sometimes they're the lessons we carry, the kindness we remember, and the people who believed in us when no one else did. Today, Daniel Walker proved that the right encouragement can change a life, and sometimes even the world,